Welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts online series, At Home, Artists in Conversation. I'm Molly Dotson, the Assistant Curator of Rare Books and Manuscripts at the Center, and I'm delighted that you've joined us today for our program with explorer artist Tony Foster and Duncan Robinson, former director of the Yale Center for British Art and also former director of the Fitzwilliam Museum, University of Cambridge. Before I turn over the program to Duncan, who will introduce Tony, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items. Please note that this program will be recorded and live closed captioning will be available. Your camera and audio will remain muted throughout the program, and you will find your chat feature disabled as well. Instead, we invite you to use the Q&A feature on your main toolbar, which is where we will gather your questions for Tony. After the presentation, we'll try to answer as many questions as time permits before we conclude at 1 o'clock. And now it's my pleasure to hand over the program to Duncan.
Thank you very much, Molly. And we look forward to seeing you later during the question and answer session. The first time I introduced Tony to an audience in New Haven was in May of 1985, just before he gave a talk to introduce his exhibition of Thoreau's Country, Walks and Canoe Journeys through New England. Ever since then, for the last 35 years, I've followed his footsteps around the world, not as some of his friends have, as traveling companions sharing the trials and tribulations of the journeys, but from the comfort and safety of my armchair. I've been able to do it because of the spectacular results of those journeys, the watercolor diaries, which disclose in vivid detail Tony's experiences as an artist explorer. Before we start our conversation, can I just remind you that Tony actually belongs to a great tradition in British art, that of painters, draftsmen, who traveled overseas to sometimes on voyages of discovery, sometimes as camp followers of grand tourists as they crossed the Alps on their way to Italy. In both of those cases, the role of those artists was to make records of their journeys for the benefit of their patrons. The difference is, of course, that Tony is his own master. He decides when to go and where to go. And he's increasingly motivated by a deep sense that our planet is threatened by forces for which we must bear some responsibility, whether it's climate change or the indiscriminate exploitation of natural resources. Tony is first and foremost an artist, and his chosen means of expression is watercolor. But like any artist worth looking at or listening to, he has something to say about the world we live in. To put it in his own words, we cannot continue to use it as if ours was the only generation that needs it. Tony, you've said on more than one occasion that I quote you, all my work is about journeys. I think I'm right in saying that the first of those was in 1982, when you teamed up with the photographer James Revilius, and the two of you set off to retrace the steps of the 19th century writer Robert Louis Stevenson, who in the 1870s published his Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes. Here the two of you are, notably without a donkey, of course, and that doesn't surprise me given the difficulties that Stevenson had with his. But I wonder if you'd start by just telling us how this came about, this journey, the link to Stevenson, and indeed what motivated the two of you to set off to the south of France all those years ago.
Well, I suppose I had been making, previous to this, James and I had teamed up on several occasions to make more modest journeys in the UK, sometimes across Dartmoor or sometimes along the cliffs in Cornwall. On one occasion went off to Wales for a few days to work together. And we found that our working methods were compatible. The pace at which we worked was very similar, in that James would take very, very long periods of time to make a single photograph, and I would take very long periods of time to make one single painting. And we found we were entirely compatible in many ways and good friends. And I guess we both thought that the time had come to try something a little more adventurous. And at the time, or shortly before this, somebody had given me Stevenson's Travels with the Donkey, a lovely 19th century copy. And I was entranced by it. It's a delightful book, and he makes light of the hardships, and it's humorous and full of fun, really. Of course, many of the difficulties were caused by his donkey, Modestine. And so we decided against the donkey. Instead, we took a golf trolley. And so we hauled that golf trolley up and down the mountains of the Cevennes. And he took about 10 days, I think, to do his journey. And we took about 3.5 weeks because, of course, we were making paintings and photographs along the way. And that resulted in an exhibition that opened at the Kearton Gallery in London and attracted quite a lot of interest. And then moved on to French cultural institutes in Scotland, because, of course, Stevenson was Scottish. And that really gave me a taste, I suppose, for working on more extended journeys rather than simply, walking out from my own back door.
Right. And here on the screen now, I think everyone can see one of the watercolors already prefiguring your working practice of including details. There's the map, there's the view you've painted, but there are also those little telltale packets of seeds, and sometimes there's an actual bird's feather or butterfly. Sometimes it's your almost trompe-l'oeil watercolor.
Right.
Very much the practice you established.
Yes, I think so. And in fact, it is. You can see that the diary notes, as you might say, are much more terse in this early work. It's more like the entries into a log, really, that a captain of a ship might make, just talking about direction, speed, and distance. But I did find in the end that because these journeys were so personal, really, to me, and because people actually wanted to hear about the adventures that one had or the disasters that had nearly overtaken you, I started to incorporate those into the work in much more detail, and people seemed to respond to that. It seemed to be the thing that was lacking probably from this early work, that it didn't come across as particularly personal, really.
Right. Now, I have to say that I didn't see these until quite some time later. But of course, my first sighting, if you like, of your watercolors was as a result of that journey through New England, inspired to some extent by the 19th century naturalist Henry Thoreau. And here is one of the watercolors that absolutely amazed me when you came to New Haven and came to my office in the centre and showed them to me. This was one of them, and it's always been one of my favourites. Remind us of the title.
It's a silver maple tree on the Concord River. I was canoeing down the Concord River on my own. I've got to say that at that period in my life, I hadn't really ever done any canoeing in a traditional Canadian canoe. And so I was loaned a canoe by someone who became a very great friend, Peggy Brace, her and Bill Brace, my two friends in Concord, or became my friends in Concord, loaned me their canoe, and Peggy launched me into the river from Concord itself, and then shouted instructions to me from the bridge about how I was supposed to use the J-stroke, paddling the canoe down the river. And off I went for, I think, about 10 days on my first expedition down the Concord River. Luckily for me, the Concord River is pretty slow and not at all challenging in terms of canoeing. So I managed to get the hang of it fairly swiftly and canoed my way along towards the Merrimack River, which of course is what Henry Thoreau did. This particular painting, I hammered a dead branch into the river and tied the canoe to it and sat in the canoe all day doing this painting. So it does feel like, you're almost in the middle of the river, which I was.
Well, you are, yes.
Yes.
While we're looking at it, I wonder, can I just comment very briefly on the technique, on the watercolor itself? Because I've referred you back towards a tradition of English watercolor painting, but it is to me a very good example of your mastery of the medium, the way in which you use the white of the paper as the source of light in the picture. And you practice all the tricks of the trade, if I dare, let's put it that way, in terms of using a wet brush, a dry brush, even a little bit of scratching out here and there to go back to the white of the paper to throw up a highlight. These are traditional techniques that they're by no means easily come by an artist. But again, I think they do show that the extent to which you are the master of the medium, if I may say so.
Well, it's kind of you to say so. In fact, I've never really been interested in technique. I've never read a book on how to paint watercolors or how to get certain effects. And I've always groped my way towards a solution, really, rather than being able to throw off a few quick tricks. But I was delighted to find Anne and I went to some lectures at the Royal Institution about Turner's watercolor techniques. And I was delighted to find I had exactly the same techniques without knowing it, really. I'd never read about his techniques, but I was thrilled that I got the same ones. But more by happenstance than calculation, really.
Right. So you'd agree that an artist is born, not made, presumably?
Well, in my case, as I've never been trained to do it.
Well, you mentioned Bill Brace. I think there are two images here. There's one of the moose, which is one of your encounters, and there's one of Bill.
No, this is my friend Parker, yes, who was my guide he volunteered to guide me around Maine when I was doing the Henry Thoreau series. I wrote to him as an expert on Henry Thoreau and asked him whether I could canoe it on my own. It's quite a long route. It goes across Moosehead Lake and then into the Allagash and Penobscot waterways and through several lakes and so on. And it's pretty long and arduous. And Parker wrote back saying, no, as an inexperienced canoeist, you certainly couldn't do it on your own. But he would come as my guide, free of charge, provided I allowed him to write something for a magazine about me. So, of course, I thought that was great. I didn't have to pay him, and he knew what he was talking about. And this, in particular, was a little painting I was doing of a moose while Parker was having a swim. And then the moose took to the water, and you can just see it in the photograph there in the distance. And Parker rushed and got his camera and then came back. And so I photographed Parker and the moose as well and presented it to him as a souvenir of our journey.
Right, so the inquisitive photographer is there. The cap line on the right of the image.
Yes, that's it, exactly.
So for a while you continued to be inspired by your 19th century predecessors as travelers and also as people who at the time cared a great deal about the natural environment. John Muir, the Scottish-born naturalist and something of a philosopher of nature, who is generally known as the father of national parks because of the part he played in persuading the administration in Washington to declare as national parks vast tracts of American countryside. So tell us a bit more about Muir, about the journey you took following in his footsteps in the High Sierra, and as a result, these, again, wonderful watercolors in which you literally map your progress and give us a very clear idea of what you encountered.
Yes, well, this was, in fact, suggested to me by Bill Brace. He said, now you've done Thoreau, you really should do John Muir. And I said, well, who's John Muir? I'd never heard of him. And Bill Brace was absolutely astonished. And he said, well, he's the patron saint of America's national parks. He's a Scotsman. You ought to know him. I discovered, much to my astonishment, that very few people in Scotland had even heard of him, let alone in England. But of course, I started studying it. And Bill Brace had actually suggested this to me as a sort of a joke, because he didn't think that it would be at all feasible to do the entire John Muir Trail and paint pictures at the same time, particularly not for an Englishman who he thought was not exactly effete, but he didn't think of me as a rugged kind of character. And so he sort of said it threw it down as a sort of a challenge, thinking that I would not take it up. But in fact, I persuaded Parker to come with me on this journey too. And Bill, I think, feeling rather guilty that he'd set me off on this, what he thought was a pretty difficult task, he then volunteered to join us on the trail and to bring in fresh supplies for us, because this took us altogether 50 days to do the entire 215 miles from Yosemite down to Lone Pine. And it's a rugged trail, certainly. You're up sometimes 12, 13,000 feet. Some days you're going over one pass after another. And it is fairly heavy going, particularly if you're carrying painting equipment with you, a drawing board, paints, and all the other things you need, as well as all your camping stuff and your food. As I say, it's pretty heavy going. So most people do it in about 10 to 14 days, but of course, they're not painting. So that's why it took us 50 days. So I think it's probably a world record for the slowest traverse of the John Muir Trail. And this painting, I think, is about, 5 feet long, I think. And I claim that it's the longest watercolor anybody's ever done it inside a tent, because it started to pour with rain when I was doing the sky. And I took the thing into the tent in order to get the sky done and get the thing out of the rain, and continued to paint in there a little while the rainstorm passed over.
Your Yale audience also will be interested to see that it's from Mather Pass to Pinchot Pass.
Yes.
Clifford Pinchot is in fact the person who founded the Yale School of Forestry.
Yes, that's a wonderful coincidence, isn't it?
There's a definite link there, which
Yes.
that would appreciate. As you walked the Muir Trail, from your notes and diaries, I get the sense that, again, you became increasingly aware of what had happened since the 1870s when Muir walked the High Sierra. So some of your comments are really quite critical about the way that so-called civilization has moved into these areas and, as a result, compromised their natural beauty.
Yes, I mean, I suppose in a way, if you're fit enough and have the interest to do these longer and more remote trails, I suppose you do begin to realize that actually that isn't what most people want. Most people want easy access. They don't want to have to slog their way up into the mountains. They want to be able to drive up there. And so I suppose there is this always this conflict really between those of us who enjoy being in untouched, beautiful places and extraordinary places, and those people who want to kind of tick it off by driving to the top of it, taking a photograph, and then driving to a comfortable motel or driving home again. And I'm sorry to say that that conflict is generally resolved in favor of the people who want to do it the easy way and drive up there in the car and have a picnic and then drive away again. And because of that, of course, I always feel that they completely destroy whatever it was they came to find. And I suppose that's my personal take on it, really. But the more I did of this work in wilder places, the more I realized how much under threat they all are. I mean, mostly they're only preserved at the moment in most of the world because nobody's found a way to exploit them yet.
Just want to mention before we move on that this journey was exhibited actually in Scotland and England, but also at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., which is where I saw it.
Yes.
The other person who saw it there was somebody called Jane Woodward, whom we're going to return to later when we talk about the foundation. I think it's significant that Jane saw your work. She'd never heard of you before. She'd certainly never met you. And she became an instant convert, given her own interest in the environment on the basis of the work you were producing. But we'll come back to Jane later. And I think if we may, we'll move on. Now, there's another. This is also from...
Yes, this is actually the Yosemite where the journey starts, but we put this one in after the one before it because this was done at a later period, actually, for an exhibition at the Autry Museum in Los Angeles, who were doing a big show about Yosemite with Ansel Adams and all sorts of people who'd worked there over the years. And it was a wonderful, wonderful show. And they asked me if I would go and make a painting of Yosemite to contribute to the show. And so I went to do this one. And this is actually a view of Yosemite, which is, I mean, an absolutely, utterly extraordinary place. In a way, it illustrates what I was saying, because I think that we did this in August. And I think at that time, we were just thunderstruck by the fact that the whole of the valley floor really is turned into one gigantic car park. And traffic jams, people can't move, everybody hooting and getting cross because they've come to find, this extraordinary beauty. And of course, they can't see it because they're sitting in their cars. And in a way, this is also, it shows a sort of further development in the work in that all the little souvenirs along the bottom here, this is quite a big painting. In fact, it's about 4 feet, I think, by 3 feet, or 4'6", I think. All the souvenirs in here are actually the history of the Grand Canyon from prehistory, from geological history, all the way through to my camping permit, which is the last souvenir. We've got an arrowhead and then the camping permit to show that it now belongs to the National Park Service. And so it's the history of the Grand Canyon really in a little strip of, 2 feet long.
We're going to see a lot more of what I refer to as your marginalia.
Yes.
I love those packets of sand. And of course, it reminds me of the obvious quote from Blake that you can see eternity in a grain of sand.
Yes, absolutely. That's what it's about, really. These are sort of touchstones, really, for ideas and philosophies and thoughts that I have as I'm making the work.
Okay, on to the Grand Canyon. And this is perhaps the site that has had the most endless fascination for you over the years.
It is. I've been back many times. And Bill Brace is the man on the left, and Parker Huber, the man in the middle, and me, of course, on the right.
Identified yourself because I wouldn't have recognized you under that hat.
Well, also, that looks like a much younger man, doesn't it? Which, of course, it was. And Bill Brace initially suggested, once again, he was always full of ideas for things we ought to do. And he said, why don't we go to the Grand Canyon? And I said, well, I don't really want to, because I think it's already been painted far too often. Certainly millions and millions of photographs have been taken in the place. I don't believe there's anything new to say about it. And Bill said, well, I'll tell you what, I will pay for your expenses to come. And we'll go down into the canyon. We'll spend a couple of days down there and come back out. And if you don't like it, you don't have to pay me back. And so I thought, oh, great, a good free trip to the canyon. And I went, and we hiked down into the canyon and slept down there. We didn't bother to take tents. So, of course, it poured and rained. We slept on rocks in the pouring rain for a couple of nights and then hiked back out again. But I did detect during that miserable trip what an extraordinary place this would be to do some work. And so I did an entire exhibition about the canyon, which took me 3 years basically to do.
So you did find something new to say, okay?
I suppose I did.
Here we've got the Turquoise Canyon.
Yes. This was part of a very rugged journey. We did a 30-day journey in the inner canyon. I guess altogether I probably walked about 400 miles of the canyon, mostly at the level of the Tonto platform, which is about halfway down. And this was part of a 30-day journey with Parker and Bill from the Bass Trail to the Hermit Trail.
So here you are now in front of your easel. And yes, I love this photograph because it does give people an idea of the challenges you've set yourself to take watercolor paper, these dimensions, and to somehow rig up an easel using God knows what. I'm amazed it doesn't just blow off the edge there. And it also shows that, you know, you do this work on site. And a lot of people might think that you cook these things up in the studio afterwards from little sketches you've made.
I don't make sketches, really. I mean, for example, the drawing on that painting there took 4 days before I even started to paint it. And then the painting itself took another 19 days to get enough information on it to bring it home and to finish it in the studio. So I always say that my paintings are resolved on site, which means in a way they've made up their own rules about how they're going to be finished. The site work is absolutely not just necessary. I mean, it's what the work is about. It's about your experiences living there for a while and describing them in as honest a way as you can. Yeah, the drawing board doesn't blow away because it's lashed down with guy lines and held down with rocks and tree trunks balanced on it in order to hold it in place. Quite often there's a strong up canyon wind every afternoon and it could easily blow away otherwise. But that painting is 7 feet by 4. And there again, the marginalia along the bottom is, I went into the Grand Canyon Museum and borrowed, they gave me a desk and a light, and I was allowed to take things out of their drawer finds that they got. And that's about the fact that the canyon was and still is to some extent, a place where Native American tribes lived very happily for thousands of years. And so there again, the national park haven't owned it that long really in terms of the canyon's age.
Right. I'm going to interrupt you again just to make the point that I find it extraordinary that you capture the canyon in the greatest of detail, minute detail, and yet you still manage to convey that extraordinary sense of distance. And you do it in a way that no camera can do. You talk about finding something new, but the camera does not convey the experience of the canyon. And I speak to somebody who's been there, not like you, way down, but I visited it as a tourist on the rim from different points of view 2 or 3 times. And you never lose that sense of awe of the scale of the thing. And I just don't know how you manage to convey that so effectively. You do it differently from other artists in the past. We're both great admirers of Thomas Moran as one of the first American painters to produce a whole body of work based on the canyon. But Moran is a 19th century idealist, a kind of romantic painter who composes in the kind of classical tradition of landscape painting. You abandon all of those conventions and you produce these sort of magnificent insights into, well, if it isn't the infinite, it's certainly the bigger subject which you go in search of.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of you to say so. I mean, I think that I suppose because of the diary elements that I include and the fact that what I'm trying to do is to interpret or record my experiences and how I feel about the place and what happens to me and so on. it would be sort of dishonest to hype up the drama of the place from what I found. I'm just trying to record really in honesty my response to it. And, it'd be very difficult for me to, put in massive thunderstorms and all the things that Moran would do in order to dramatize the thing, and then write a diary that says, a bit of a dull day today, because those two things wouldn't work together. And so I suppose really, if I were to say anything about it, it would be that I'm just trying to be honest all the time about what I see and how I respond to it.
This is to fast forward to 2016, but I want to show this because this snapshot was taken by me when Lisa, my wife, and I visited Tony in his studio to see the series of 6 views which he made on a 6-day canoe trip down the Colorado River. And he did it specifically to make a gift to the Yale Centre for British Art of one of his journeys. A journey he'd done before. He calls it Heraclitus III, quoting the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, that you can't step into the same stream twice because everything changes. But here it is, laid out on the studio table with all of the marginalia, memorabilia, ready to be mounted up with the drawings before being shipped to New Haven. So again, I'm showing that just because I think it's of relevance and of interest to the people who are watching this today. Those are now part of the permanent collection at the centre. But we must move on. I'm very conscious of the fact that time will cut us both off. Let's move on to rainforests.
Okay.
This picture of you seated, I think, somewhat precariously on the rock ledge above the floor. Over to you, Tony.
Well, this is actually a place called Kaieteur Falls in Guyana. I wanted to find a waterfall, an enormous waterfall that wasn't a tourist attraction. And of course, there aren't many of them. Most enormous waterfalls are tourist attractions. But this is an 800-foot single drop waterfall in Guyana. And very, very few people ever visit it because Guyana hasn't got many attractions for a tourist. And this is a remote spot. It was 3 days, I think, upriver in a small boat, and then another day climbing up onto the plateau in order to get there. And when I arrived, I stayed with a Patamona Indian who was called Sir Paul because he was the tribal school teacher. He lived in a hut just by the waterfall. And so I shared a hut with him for 30 days while I did 3 paintings of the waterfall. And so this was all part of my rainforest work, although it was done actually for an exhibition which was called Watermarks, which was about water in all its forms. But in fact, of course, it's right in the middle of the Guyanese rainforest.
Where's this?
Now, this one's in Costa Rica, and this is a 4-foot square painting of a rainforest, which I'm rather proud of, as a matter of fact, because the trick or the difficulty in painting rainforest is that if you're not careful, it ends up looking like a William Morris wallpaper, just row after row of green leaves. The difficulty is to find something that actually works in technical terms as a painting. In sort of more formal terms, you have to be able to see through to something. And in this case, you can see through the trees to other trees. And you can imagine some of these trees are absolutely enormous, which they are. The interlocking lianas and all the other things that you find, the sheer variety and the sheer fecundity of the place. Trying to incorporate that, impart that without it becoming wallpaper. I think I've sort of succeeded with this one, I must say. I was very pleased with it.
Yes. Well, you've certainly created the depth. So it's not a wallpaper.
Yes. This one is the Rio Sirena, also in Costa Rica. And it was done actually slightly after my rainforest exhibition, which opened at Harwood House, or Harewood House in Yorkshire, owned by Lord and Lady Harwood, who he is the Queen's cousin. And the exhibition opened there. When I went, I realized that, in fact, I hadn't got a good river painting in it. And so I went back to Costa Rica, especially to paint this one painting, really, of Rio Sirena. And Lord Harwood, when they were having supper with him, and Prince Michael of Kent, and Lord and Lady Harwood, and Lord and Lady Lascelles, what they called a little family supper, asked me what I was doing next. And I said, well, I'm going to go to Exeter Museum to paint a caiman, because the river is full of caiman. They're like an alligator, but it's specific to South America. And there are lots of them in the river. So I knew that Exeter Museum had a stuffed one, which I could borrow to paint. And he said, well, it's a bit awkward, isn't it, going back to Exeter every day? And I said, well, it's only 70 miles. And he said, well, I think we might have some caiman. Would you like to borrow one? And I said, oh, yeah, I'd love to. So he pressed a little button under the table, and in came the butler. Yes, my lord. And he said, send the steward in, will you? So the steward came in. Yes, my lord. And he said, have we got any caiman, stuffed caiman? And he said, I don't know, my lord. And he said, well, go and find out, will you? And so the steward came back after about an hour. And he said, well, my lord, we've got 11 alligators and 14 crocodiles, but we've only got 3 caiman. And I said, well, how big are the caiman that you've got? And he said, well, one of them's 7 feet long, and one of them's 3 feet long, and one of them's 4'6". And I said, well, my painting's 4'6". So that would suit me absolutely perfectly. Can I borrow the 4'6" one? And Lord Harwood said, wrap it up for him, will you? And then he can take it away with him when he goes. And so they wrapped it up in a picnic blanket, and I brought it back to my studio and did this study from it.
There it is.
This is Borneo, yes. This is part of the exhibition called Exploring Beauty, where I asked people I called my luminaries, people who spend long periods of time in wild places, people like David Attenborough and Robin Hambry-Tennyson, who's the explorer, climbers, geologists, botanists, biologists. I asked them all to nominate the most beautiful wild place they'd ever seen. And Robin Hambry-Tennyson nominated this place in Borneo, which is called the Deer Cave, which is this enormous, enormous cave, which apparently you could put St. Paul's Cathedral 3 times, one on top of the other, inside it. And Robin, in fact, I think was the first European who'd ever been into the cave. Of course, local hunter-gatherers knew it very well, but it was first seen by the first European was Robin, I think. And so it was important to him, and I went and sat in there. This is also part of that same series, and this, of course, is the Arctic up in northern Greenland, where I went to paint icebergs flowing into the Cangier River, from the Cangier, which is an ice river, really, and then flowing finally into the Atlantic. That painting was about 4'6" or 5 feet, I think. Oh, and here we are painting, working underwater. Yes.
Not content with the Earth's surface, you plumbed the depths as well.
Well, actually, this was David Attenborough's fault. He suggested the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen were coral reefs. And so that meant I had to devise a way of working underwater in order to take up his suggestion. And so I would make drawings underwater using Caran d'Ache crayons on plastic drafting film. And I would sit there perfectly happily for an hour, and the fish would, generally speaking, take not much notice of me. And actually, we were very collaborative. They would pose nicely, and it turned out to be quite easy to draw. And then I would make paintings, or a painting from the sketches. That's the only time I ever do that. But this is a watercolor about 4'6" square. And that is a giant grouper, which kept nudging me because the giant groupers go to this particular part of Little Cayman to breed. In fact, I never discovered whether it was trying to breed with me or was trying to get me to move out of the way because it wanted to approach another grouper in order to mate. But anyway, it kept coming out and nudging me and then going back up into the coral.
Well, as if the Grand Canyon wasn't a big enough subject, you then made it your mission, if you like, to explore other extremities. The canyon, a big subject, and needless to say, the highest mountain in the world, Everest.
Right. Yes.
Leading away on Everest, looking, I think, remarkably cheerful, considering that at one stage you had to be airlifted off the mountain. Once again, paintbrush, paints, easel, all in hand.
Yeah, in fact, the first year wasn't a disaster, but on the other hand, it was pretty difficult, and I didn't manage to achieve everything I wanted to. So I promised the Sherpas, who I'd by that time got a very good, friendly relationship with, that I would go back again. In fact, I went back 3 times to paint Everest. And in fact, I'm the only person I know in the world who has ever painted all 3 sides of Everest, because if you look at Everest, it's basically triangular. And this is a painting of the southwest face from Nepal. And this was the one that nearly brought me to grief, in fact. I ended up with cerebral edema and pulmonary edema and had to walk back down to about 11,000 feet, to 14,000 feet, where there was a porter's rescue clinic in order to be given oxygen and hydrocortisone and put back on my feet.
But it's typical of you that you didn't finish the painting, and instead of trying to finish it, in the safety of your own home, you went back.
Yes, I did. Yeah. It was partly because the Sherpas were as disappointed as I was that I hadn't managed to achieve what I wanted to. And they felt slightly responsible. So I said, no, I'm going to come back and finish it. And sure enough, I went back. And this is the east face, which has been seen by very, very few people because it's very, very difficult to get to and also almost impossible to climb. But it is a summer grazing for the yaks. And so the yak drivers set up these piles of stones to act as guidelines when the place is covered in snow, which it usually is. And our party was actually the first one to get up to the east face that year.
Tony, I can see that Molly's appeared because she's more or less telling us to hurry up and finish. So
okay.
Even so, I still want you to tell us about that bit of memorabilia at the bottom there.
Yes, it's a thing called a kata, which is a silk scarf, which has got all sorts of Buddhist symbols on it, which the Nepalis and the Tibetans hang around your neck as a symbol of affection and respect, I think, when you leave. And I would often be standing in Kathmandu airport with half a dozen of these scarves hanging around my neck, which have been given to me by the porters and the cook and the Sherpas. And in this case, this one is wrapped in a Chinese newspaper because I'm in Tibet now. It's to symbolize the fact that the Chinese, of course, are ruling Tibet and are trying to do away with Tibetan Buddhism, trying to suppress it. And so it's sealed up with Chinese seals, but you'll notice that the kata is bursting out at both ends in the way that one hopes that the Buddhism will not be wiped out by being suppressed by the Chinese. And so it's a symbolic object, really, in many ways.
It also reminds us, I think, that although you never put people into your pictures as such, as representations, the people are there because of these very subtle references to the civilizations, past and present, that occupy these out-of-the-way places. I find that very moving. But talking of moving, we're going to
have to move on. Nicely done, Douglas.
We're going to end with a very brief comment about sacred places.
Yes, I'll be brief. This was a series about sacred places of the American Southwest, where I thought was very, very rich in different faiths, different tribal beliefs, and different religions. And I wanted to find places that was of symbolic importance to all these different faiths. You'll see that the marginalia in this case contain all sorts of religious and symbolic objects which go with the paintings of places which were of symbolic importance to several tribal companies. And similarly with this one, this is the San Juan River, and there again of great importance to the tribes and to the Mormons.
Right, absolutely. I think this is also the point at which to mention the foundation again, because Jane Woodward, whom we referred to earlier, when she became involved with Tony, one of the points that she made was that it was important to try to keep some of these journeys together, to keep them intact, not to allow them to be broken up and distributed among individual collectors. And so in this case, she essentially wanted sacred places as an entity, the whole body of work from that particular project of Tony's. And at the time, she set up the Foster Art and Wilderness Foundation in Palo Alto, in California, and opened eventually the gallery archival center there at 940 Commercial Street. Tony, you might want to say a little bit about the foundation before I make my apologies to everyone, including you, for talking too much, for overrunning. I think as people can tell, you and I, left to our own devices, would still be talking an hour from now.
We would. Plenty more to say. Well, of course, what artist could resist such an extraordinary offer of being given such an extraordinarily beautiful space in which a permanent exhibition of the work would be held? I mean, it is just such an extraordinary thing. I know other example where a living artist has had such a thing happen to them. I couldn't say it's beyond my wildest dreams. I couldn't have even dreamt of such a thing. But Jane, being an imaginative and forceful person, pushed through this idea that she would set this place up and purchase this entire exhibition for the foundation and the subsequent exhibition, which was called Exploring Beauty. So those two exhibitions are on exhibition now permanently and can be visited free of charge and is widely used by the local population and local environmental groups, and people hold meetings there and all sorts of fun things. And these paintings are all on display there as part of the permanent exhibition.
Exploring beauty. Well, if people want to explore beauty, they'll have to give us another hour for that.
Yes, that's right.
There's a whole philosophy behind that exhibition. It's not just a journey. We've already touched on it, so we're going to move on very, very quickly. But in a way, the wheel comes full circle, because in exploring beauty, we have your own backyard.
We do, yes. This is Tywardreath Marsh, which is a place of great delight. Yes.
That you have said, strangely enough, I find it harder to make work about Cornwall than anywhere else.
Yes.
That hasn't deterred you, and it hasn't deterred you from the last of the projects, which has only just been completed, your lockdown diary. Here is one artist's response to the crisis which threatens all of us right now. No longer able to wear his 7-league boots and travel the globe, Tony took a journey out of his own studio every day for 56 days. Right, Tony?
Correct, yes. That's how long the lockdown lasted, the first one. We've been in another one recently, which I've started, and so I'm working on that now. But yes, this was observations and notes and thoughts and ideas that I had every day as I went for my morning walk with a sketchbook and a stub of a pencil, and I just made notes and did drawings. And then in the afternoon, I'd make little paintings from my drawings and joined them all together like a lovely patchwork quilt.
And right at the bottom, there are lots of little inscriptions. They won't legible on the screen, but the one on the far right is a quotation from Robert Frost. 2 roads converged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by. I've always found that poem very moving, although Frost meant it as a joke, apparently. But you don't quote the last line, and that has made all the difference.
Yes.
You have made all the difference. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Duncan. Thank you very much.
Molly, your cue is long overdue. Further apologies. Off you go.
We have quite a lot of questions rolling in, so I'll just jump in with a couple of questions related to your practice, Tony. Could you tell the audience how long it takes you to complete one of these paintings? And another attendee has asked, could you speak more about that moment at which you decided to paint watercolors at such a large scale?
How long does it take to complete them? Well, of course, that depends very much on the size and also the amount of detail. I mean, rainforest paintings take a lot longer, for example, than desert paintings, because there's just so much more detail that you have to cope with. But a big painting, well, that big Grand Canyon painting took 23 days, day after day, sitting there just working on it, and then time in the studio too. So, but then a small painting might take 2 days, or a really small painting might only take a day. But on average, I would say that a painting usually takes about 4 and 10 days on site, and then a period of weeks in the studio. I mean, I'm pretty slow, really. So I guess I generally do between 12 and 20 paintings a year. Seldom would do more than that, I think. And I work all the time, so they're slow to produce.
If you could describe the moment at which you decided to paint at such a large scale.
Oh, well, I think what it was, the places I was working, they just demand, I mean, when I come across something that's so inspiring, they just demand a painting of substantial size. And I found that the more my technique has improved, really, I suppose, the larger the paintings have become, because I felt competent to take on such big subjects with such big sheets of paper. And there's nothing better than having somebody absolutely stop in their tracks when they see one of these big paintings, and they stand awestruck in front of them. And that is a wonderful, wonderful feeling. Whereas small paintings, lots of people feel, well, I can take my sketchbook and do that. That looks like a great way to earn your living. But when I do the big ones, suddenly people think, my goodness, this is work of a completely different order. And it sort of throws into perspective the efforts that I make in order to make the work.
We have one other question related to process, and that is going back to the earlier John Muir piece. There was a question about the wildflowers that are depicted, and if those were done in watercolor or some other element as part of the marginalia at the bottom of that painting.
No, they were done in watercolor. Yeah, they were done on site in watercolor. I also have a sketchbook as well as a roll of paper, so I can paint any size I like, and very often do those little studies, at the same time. I don't know if anybody can see this because my picture's a little small, but anyway, this is my paint box. It's about the size of a packet of cigarettes, and every single brushstroke of every painting I've ever done has been done from these tiny Winsor & Newton Bijou #2 boxes. It's pretty simple, that's what's so wonderful about watercolor is, it's light to carry, it's easy to, the color is very dense, so they don't wear out very easily. And then this is my paint palette. It's the top of a Tupperware lid. It's flexible, doesn't weigh anything, fits in your backpack. Just keep it simple. That's why I love watercolor, because you can get such wonderful effects with such tiny materials.
There's a question about your diaries. You're keeping a diary as you're going on these expeditions. Do you also maintain that practice at home, and how do those compare?
I meant to bring one to show you. In fact, it's just a little tiny red notebook, the sort that you would write your accounts in the 1950s. I've got a stack of those which I carry with me. There again, they weigh nothing, they cost nothing, and they've got everything you need. They've got plenty of paper. And so the answer to your question is no, I don't keep diaries at home, except that last lockdown diary, which you saw, because I wanted to record the event of being in lockdown, which is unusual for everybody, except prisoners perhaps. But and so I did keep that as my diary, really, but that was more like a visual diary, and that's a written diary. But otherwise, no, I don't keep a diary at home. It would be too dull. It would say, got up at 7, had tea, went for a walk, came home, had breakfast, went to the studio, had lunch, went to the studio, had supper, watched television for 2 hours, went to bed. That would be it every day, day after day. So it'd be dull stuff. The only excitement I have is when I'm on my journeys, really.
How did you find the constraint of lockdown affecting your artistic practice? You've recorded this diary, but were there other things you were thinking about?
Well, in fact, I was booked in to do a canoe journey down the Green River in Utah for an exhibition that I'm making for the Whitney West in Cody, Wyoming, which is supposed to open in 2022. And so, of course, I couldn't possibly do that. I couldn't travel. And so I then had to cast around for what am I going to do during this time? I can't just, play snakes and ladders or watch TV. So I started to do some paintings of trees, wonderful, wonderful ancient trees in Cornwall. And I found quite a lot of really interesting ones. I've been searching around and people have been finding them for me and pointing them out. And that's been a really interesting thing to do. And then I did this, of course, this lockdown diary. And so that's kept me pretty busy, really. And I turned this into a print, which I've been selling to raise money for environmental charities. And they're still for sale if anyone wants to buy one, either through the foundation or through my website. And so far, we've sold a lot of them and raised quite a lot of money. So that's great. And so that's what's been keeping me occupied. But I'm itching to get back to painting those dramatic places I can find in wild country.
There's a question, beyond Cornwall, do you make paintings of other landscapes in the UK?
Very little, to be perfectly honest. I think the trouble is that when you go into the middle of these wild places to work, it's such a lot of hard work to get there, and it's often quite expensive too, and it's taken a long time, a lot of planning, and so you go and you have no choice but to come back with paintings. No matter what the weather's like, no matter how uncomfortable it is, no matter how rain pours down or the wind howls or it's freezing cold or if you're in a desert it's too hot, it's always uncomfortable. And so you're there for a purpose, and the purpose is to make paintings. And there's no way out of it. You've got your tent, you've got your food, you've got your painting equipment, get on with it and stop complaining. But if you're sitting, on a cliff in Cornwall and it starts to rain and the wind comes and it's cold and miserable, and you think, what on earth am I sitting here for? I've got a perfectly good studio only, 20 minutes from here. And then the temptation to go home and make a cup of tea and sit in the studio is just too great. And so, any excuse not to have to sit there, you would take it. But because I drive myself out or force myself out to these wild places, which are damned uncomfortable, I have no choice but to get on with it.
Am I allowed to interrupt for a minute and just say that I think you really enjoy the challenge, Tony, and you talk about, you make it all sound so simple, you know, the palette, which is the Tupperware lid, the paint box is the size of a cigarette pack. In fact, you're dealing with a very fragile medium, and it's putative. You know, you're taking these huge sheets of paper out into deserts and storms and everything else. They can be spoiled by rain. You said you have to take them into a tent to finish them sometimes. I think you set yourself almost the impossible task as a challenge, and you overcome it in the most incredible way. Don't minimize the difficulty of handling watercolors in the extremities of climate that you take.
Well, yeah, I suppose you're right. I mean, I have always been someone who will try and push things to their limits. I mean, when I was an adolescent, I was a terrible adolescent because I was always pushing things to the limits, you know, in any way I could. And I guess you're right in a way in that I do try and, I mean, you know, as you say, painting Everest, probably the highest painting anybody's ever done, one of the biggest paintings on site ever done of the Grand Canyon, I would think. But I don't go out to break records. It's not till afterwards I think, oh, I bet nobody's ever done anything bigger than that on site, and I bet nobody else has ever painted all three faces of Everest. But I don't set out to do it. It just sort of ends up that way.
Why didn't the water freeze all that way up Everest?
Oh, because I mixed gin with the paint water. It was something I learned from someone who was the great niece of Birdie Bowers, who went with Shackleton. And she had some wonderful watercolors heading towards the South Pole. And I said, how on earth did he do that without the water freezing? She said, oh, just used to mix gin with it. And I've done that ever since, and it works perfectly well. Take half a bottle of gin with you, and that's usually enough to see you through most cold places.
We have another question asking how many brushes you take with you.
I should have brought those to show you too. Far too many is the answer. You might have seen a little plastic tube propped up next to some of my paintings, and that's jammed full of probably 30 brushes. Everything from the most beautiful brush I always use is the number 6 Kolinsky Sable. I've also got number 8s and number 10 Kolinsky Sables. Those are very expensive. There might be $150 for one of those, all the way through to big mop brushes to mop on water, and chisel brushes in order to sometimes take paint off the paper instead of putting it on. I have a whole range of different brushes because I'm paranoid that I might get somewhere and not have exactly the right brush. In fact, one of my favorite brushes I stole it from my wife, who's also an artist. She had it when she was a student, so that's 50 years ago. And it's got hardly any bristles left on it, but it's an old sable brush, which is worn down to the stub. And it's perfect for doing little bushes in the distance. And I always, I think, oh, where's that little brush? Oh, yes, I've got it. I'm all right. So I generally have about 20 or 30 brushes, I think.
We have one more question about the sort of marginalia again. A question about how you rendered the small topographical maps that are in the earlier paintings that were shown, like the John Muir Yosemite works. A question of whether they're also rendered in watercolor, or do you involve any kind of collage elements as well?
Right. No, in fact, those early ones are done in watercolor. I realized after I've been doing it for several years that making those maps was driving me insane. And so I stopped doing it and thought, why am I doing this? I've got perfectly good maps already. Why don't I just cut bits out of them? They're more accurate than my watercolors and serve the purpose just as well, which is to show people the route and show people where I was actually sitting when I did the work I was doing. And so I decided that life was actually too short to spend 4 or 5 days painting a map when I had a perfectly good map in front of me. So so I did switch, and I'm glad I did.
Well, I think we have reached our time for today, unfortunately. Thank you so much, Tony, Duncan, and everyone in the audience. I would like to invite you all to join us for our next online artist conversation. That's happening on Friday, January 29th at 12 p.m. Eastern. The artist Jagdeep Raina will be in conversation with Mariam Ohadi Hamadani, postdoctoral research associate in the research department at the center. Thanks again to all of you joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Duncan. Thanks, everybody.